Okay, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. So before we get into the material for today, I do want to make note of a couple things. Unfortunately, the university sent out some revised policies that would make the current course policies change just a little bit. So one of the ones being that they did confirm that you are required to have 3 hours for your exam. So unfortunately, that makes your exam substantially longer. It was originally going to be about 100 questions. Now, unfortunately, it has to be a little bit more than that to fill up the 3 hours. However, unlike the last exam, you will get a minute 20 per question, which does constitute a 33% increase over 1 minute. And you'll also have the entire week of testing, which is from the 24th up until the 29th. So that's when the exam will be open. And you'll still have open book, open note, of course. So just some minor modifications in this new syllabus. I just want to let you all know that's what's going to be going on. Let me know if there's any questions about it. Apart from that, there's really not any major changes. The other change that I made is that you'll basically just submit the file if you do the alternate assignment instead of doing the final. Of course, you can do this essay. I don't recommend it, of course, because doing an essay over a test is probably not going to be a great. It's going to be a lot of extra work, and it's going to be something I don't recommend for a lot of reasons. But if you decide to do that, you'll have to submit it to the file submission instead of via email. But apart from that, like I said, it's just minor modifications. The main thing is that you'll have about 50 extra questions, and you'll also have the week to do it. So I'm just going to send that out. Let me see if there's any questions. Great question, by the way, about the research participation. If you do research participation, that goes into the final course grade. So inside of Canvas, there should be about 4 different places extra credit can go. One would be Exam 1, one would be Exam 2, one would be Exam 3, and then there's also a course bonus points, I think it's called. Anything you do for research will go into that. So let me know if you have any other questions about this. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of cover the technology guide for today, which is cloud computing. And like I said, feel free to go ahead and leave comments and questions about any of the course material for the semester, and I'll get to that as soon as I'm done with this. I'm going to go pretty quickly through cloud computing. We've talked about it a good bit already. What cloud computing is simply changing where we do our computing tasks. So we have tasks like transaction processing, we have tasks like online retailing. Basically we have a couple different places we could do the computing for that. One, we could do it on site where we control and own everything. Or also, we could use cloud computing where we basically lease out. We have some formalized sort of a lease agreement where we're going to specify the terms, we're going to specify the computational needs, but that provides us with a lot of advantages, and we're going to talk about some of those. So specifically, when we use cloud computing services, we don't have to purchase all the infrastructure ourselves. So that gives us a couple major advantages. The first being, it's going to greatly reduce the initial cost to do the computational task, because whereas you may have to purchase $100,000 worth of equipment, you now don't have to purchase anything, and you may pay $2,000 a month, or whatever the numbers may work out to be. And that also allows us to be pretty scalable, because where in other cases we may be limited by a lot of different things, we don't have finite amount of hardware with cloud computing. In other words, if our needs change, we can simply change the agreement to where now maybe we purchase additional capacity, and possibly even for a reduced rate over what we're paying per capacity now. This can also have benefits in terms of reliability. So specifically, when we're talking about this, we're talking about from the context of making sure that we have an agreement in place that specifies the amount of downtime. We can hold them to that a lot better than we could internal. So that's certainly an advantage. Of course, it can be off-site, which can lead to a lot of different benefits for the firm. Specifically, when we're thinking about things like risk diversification, it's a lot easier to have your data and have your operations be able to operate across multiple locations with cloud computing than it would be if you had to use on-premise, because then you'd have to go out and purchase additional sites, whereas you could simply go with a vendor that already provides that. So that's pretty much some of the advantages. Some different types of cloud computing. I don't think these are on the exam, but just to kind of go over them briefly, you have the idea of a public cloud, and you have the idea of a private cloud. And those differ because in a public cloud, you're going to have various entities that are going to be sharing physical devices, and they're not going to be able to access each other's information because they're going to be using virtualization to provide unique kind of partitioned off environments. However, there are, of course, various malware that can break that, and we're seeing that on the hardware level, actually. You look into some of these CPU vulnerabilities, they're not a huge deal for an end user. However, for a cloud computing standpoint, that can be pretty problematic because you can run software that can basically exploit the virtualization and access other information. So private cloud doesn't have that problem. Private cloud devotes the hardware to the customer. It's going to be a lot more expensive, of course, because previously you may have a server that can be divided up, and now you have a server that cannot be divided up. So that's going to be substantially more expensive. And then hybrid cloud basically has some aspects of each. So basically with a hybrid cloud, you'd be able to have hardware, if you wanted it, that was completely separate from other clients, and you could also have the option to not have it. Okay, so here's where I think this gets pretty interesting and pretty important. So we have different cloud computing services. And basically what we have is we have on-premise where we control everything, and we have software as a service where we, the firm, don't control a single thing. It's all managed by the vendor, which is, of course, whoever we're purchasing the service from. And in between that, we have these two: infrastructure as a service, where they handle most of the servers themselves. They handle the networking to send and receive data. They handle the virtualization, and then they give us basically a spot where we can install any operating system, we can install any applications that we want. And platform as a service, we have less control than that. We can install whatever applications, but they specify the OS, they specify the versions of everything, and all we control is what runs on side of the operating system they provide us. Software as a service, of course, they provide us with the application already installed, and we access it. This is pretty common for things like Office applications. It's also common for things like some ERPs, particularly if you're doing a vanilla style ERP where you're not making a whole bunch of modifications. So just know that the amount of control that your internal IT department decreases as you move from on-premise to software as a service. And of course the inverse is true. As you move from software as a service to on-premise, your internal IT department gains more control and the vendor gains less control. So pretty straightforward. This is something that can be slightly beneficial to employees because basically what you're doing is you're allowing your employees to access information. You're making it more likely they can access information remotely. That's a good way of putting it. I'm not saying that they can access it remotely because you could have policies in place either way that would allow for remote access. But with cloud computing, it's more likely they can access it remotely. For the organization, though, this is certainly something that can greatly reduce the costs they're paying, especially if they're a smaller enterprise. A large enterprise is probably not going to notice huge cost savings because A, they're probably having multiple sites already, and B, the whole advantage of this is that it's scalable and doesn't have a huge initial investment requirement, whereas a large organization is not going to be scared off by either of those. So they have the staffing already to be able to manage it. You're just less likely to see a huge benefit. Not to say you won't see one, but you're just less likely to, the larger you are. And of course, this can also make your organizations more flexible in that you don't have capital tied up in hardware with limited capability. That's basically all there is to say there. It's like if you had 10 acres of land versus you had a lease that allowed you to scale up and down as needed. That's basically what we're comparing here. So having 10 acres of land, you may initially only need one, and then you may grow and you may find that you need 100, and that's basically what we're talking about. So, of course, there are some drawbacks. Sometimes organizations are using very old applications, and these old applications may have issues actually going into modern, into cloud environments. Specifically, if we go look at things other than infrastructure as a service, it's going to be nearly impossible to convince a vendor to run a legacy OS on a platform as a service, and certainly not on a software as a service. So that's certainly one thing to consider. And then we have reliability. It's both a benefit and a curse. And, the reason that it could be harmful to us is that we have, these systems. What if our cloud vendor doesn't live up to their agreement? Then we just, we basically get a little credit. And that's not necessarily very beneficial. Okay, sorry about that. Privacy, this could be a big concern, specifically as we talk about things like a public cloud, where there could be multiple clients on a single piece of hardware. We could certainly see some virtualization exploits take place and lead to some issues. Also, we don't physically control the information anymore. We go back to this chart here. Unless we're doing on-premise, we don't control the information, in its entirety. And, it only takes one aspect of this to have an information breach. So, by lacking that control, that can certainly cause some issues. So that kind of goes into regulatory and legal. And to address those, like I said, you just use some sort of a service level agreement where you outline what they're going to do and a memorandum of understanding to ensure that they have mutual understanding between the parties of what is required by regulation and what regulations you're subject to. So that's pretty much the conclusions and risks. Just kind of a quick rundown on cloud computing. Let me know if there's any questions about that. But certainly apart from that, I'll go ahead and start addressing any comments that you may have. So let me just see. Yeah, happy to address reading ERDs. Let me pull one up. And I'll address these in the order that I see them. Which should be the order you see them too, because I don't know why it wouldn't be. Let me see. Data management was chapter 5. Okay, here's an ERD right here. Should be good enough. So basically, the ERD is a very important diagram because it represents how data is modeled within some sort of database. So basically you have entities, and the entities are going to be represented by these large boxes. And the entities have attributes, which are elements that are pertinent to each occurrence or instance of an entity. So a student ID is actually going to be the primary key, which means it uniquely identifies each instance of student, which of course means it cannot be repeated within this entity. Don't see any foreign keys. Let's say class name, right? Here's a foreign key. It's also the primary key of this, so therefore it's going to be a foreign key inside of class. It's also a composite primary key because there's more than one attribute here acting as a primary key. That forms a composite key. And of course you also have relationships. So the way that you would read that is you would say student takes one to many classes, and a class is taken by at minimum one student, but at maximum there is no maximum to the amount of students. It's an infinite relationship there. So you basically just read it to where you go, course is taught by one and only one instructor, and then instructor teaches one to many courses. So in this example, you basically would look at this and you would read it where you would go, the entity that you're talking about, and then you actually get the minimum and maximum cardinality from the entity that you're wanting to have the relationship with. So that's pretty much just how you read it. Of course, the minimum is going to be the one that's going to be further away from the entity, and the maximum is going to be the one that's closer to the entity. Of course, down here we have an example where a professor teaches 0 to many sections, and section is taught by one and only one professor. So that pretty much covers the basics of ERDs. Let me know if that doesn't address it. Yeah, and I did take off, there's going to be substantially fewer ERD questions. They're going to be more formatted like what you've seen in class. But they're all read about the same way, where you have the primary key and you have a foreign key, and you have relationships. Yeah, so math problem, this is cumulative final, so you will see some of the math problems from last class, last unit rather. I could go through one, that's not a problem. So I'm just going to pull up one of these with answers already on it. Okay, I'll pick this example right here to go through. Basically what you're trying to do with these sort of problems is you're trying to see, based on limited information, and again, this is very limited information, if you're interested in this, take a risk management course or, multiple risk management courses, you'll see that it gets a lot more complicated than this. But basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to compare two options. You're trying to compare what they're doing now to what they could do, and you're trying to see which is going to be less costly to do, and you're going to pick the one that's less costly. So I use the analogy of, if you're at the grocery store and you have the option to purchase 2 cans of beans, you have to compare them by some unit that they're both going to share. So typically you're going to use something like cost per ounce or something, where you have the price, and you don't just compare based on price, you want to get them in a unit that's the same. So maybe you had a 32-ounce can of beans and a 16-ounce can of beans. You'd compare the price per ounce as opposed to comparing just the price. So basically what you're trying to do here is get these things in the same units. So let's just kind of run through this problem right quick. Yippee Yarn has a customer database which it protects using reasonable measures. If compromised, they'll lose $25,000 in business and pay $75,000 in restitution. This is going to happen every 20 years. In addition, consultants offer to provide additional services they claim will reduce the profitability of occurrence to once every 100 years at the cost of $10,000 up front for software licensing and $1,000 every year for maintenance and upkeep of the software. The agreement's for 10 years. What should the company do? So right off the bat here, you see that the cost of occurrence is going to be $25,000 plus $75,000 in restitution. It's just split up like that. So you just add those two together for the cost of occurrence. It gives you the likelihood of occurrence, where it says once every 20 years. Take 20 divided by 100, it gives you 0.05, which of course in percentage is 5%. So then you just multiply the cost of occurrence times the likelihood of occurrence to get an annualized number there, which is going to be $5,000. Then we compare that to what we can do using a consultant. So they're going to charge us an additional upfront $10,000 licensing fee. And also they're going to charge us $1,000 for maintenance and upkeep of the software. So we have an initial upfront cost of protection, and we have an annual operating cost of protection. Should make that a little bit more clear there. And what we can do then is we can do the lifespan operating cost. I'm just going to change this to for protection so it's even clearer. So what we do is we see that we have this agreement for 10 years, and basically we're going to take that 10, multiply it by 1,000, give us 10,000. So we have the initial upfront cost and we have the lifespan operating cost. We're just going to add those two together. 10,000 plus 10,000 gives us 20,000. And then we want to annualize the cost of protection. So we're going to take that 20,000 divided by the amount of years it's good for, which is 10 years. Again, we get that from the length of the agreement. Gives us $2,000. And we want to read a little bit further because they're going to reduce the probability of occurrence to once every 100 years. So then we take the 1 out of 100, of course gives us 1%. So then we can multiply that times the cost of occurrence, which doesn't change. We're still going to have to pay we're still going to lose business and pay restitution. So that's still going to be $100,000. Multiply that by 1% now, and we get $1,000 for the new annualized cost of occurrence. So now we want to get the total annualized cost of protection. We add in the annualized cost of protection to the annualized cost of occurrence, which is 2,000 plus 1,000 equals 3,000. So here we're comparing $5,000 for doing what we have to $3,000 for going with this firm to do some additional protective measures. So of course we're going to take the option to hire the consultants. Let me know if that doesn't cover it. Yeah, so basically, regarding what you should study, I would certainly recommend going through this list. There's, of course, 3 worksheets inside the workbook. Go through each of these terms. Think if you know what an accounting information system is. Think if you know what benefits it provides a firm, why they may do it, and do that for all these terms. I mean, of course, you don't have to think about it at that level, but just think. You see a term like DMAIC. Do you know that it means define, measure, analyze, improve, control? If you know that it means define, measure, analyze, improve, control, what do each of those steps mean? So, basically, if you know all these terms and you're pretty confident in that, then you're going to do fine on the final. There's nothing to worry about. And if, the PowerPoint may not have the information that you're looking for, you may have to find it in the textbook. You may have to find it on maybe a YouTube video or something. The PowerPoint's there as an outline. Certainly, the PowerPoint will have maybe some charts and stuff that maybe aren't even in the textbook. That's very possible. But for the most part, I think that, going back through your notes would be a great option as well. But I'm not going to make the promise that this is every single term that you'll need to know for the exam. But I will make the promise I tried to get every single term for the exam. So to my knowledge, this is the major terms that you'll need. I would say that, you could probably find one term on there that I didn't include. Maybe like a term that's not really a technological term, but is a term for something. I tried to avoid that. I really did my best to find every single term on the final and include it here. So, but there's always terms like, that could be something that I would assume. Like, for example, let's say I didn't include the word "the," and you need to know what "the" means to answer a question. I mean, that's certainly something that could be a little problematic. But I think that, by and large, I included all the terms from the content. So, great question. So in the example, would saying a section number has 0 to many professors? Let me go back to that. Okay, so what this is saying is that a professor teaches. They don't have to teach any sections, but there's no limit to the amount of sections they can teach. And that contrasts with a section, which is going to be taught by one and only one professor. So it's not uncommon in a university to have faculty members who have maybe a sabbatical, maybe they have, especially for full professors, to have the opportunity to have a semester where they're not teaching a class. They're still a professor. This is particularly true over summer. A lot of professors take summer to just do research and other things like that. It's not uncommon at all. So what this is saying is you always read these with professor teaches 0 to many sections, and section is going to be taught by one and only one professor. So you always kind of read it to where you're looking at the entity, you're saying the entity first, you're going over to the entity, and you're looking at the minimum and maximum, and then you're saying the entity. So that's pretty much how you read those. Okay, good question. Gotcha. No, I'm not going to have lockdown browser or anything like that. I think the lockdown browser causes a lot of issues, and I don't want to add any stress to the final. It's going to be a long final. I apologize for that. Like I said, university policy stipulates 3 hours for a final. However, I also won't do it to where I know some people use the feature where you can lock the exam answer once you answer it. I don't think that's a fair way to do it. I don't use that feature either. Basically, my recommendation is when you have a 3-hour block of time, have all your notes ready, have everything ready, maybe other devices, maybe have your cell phone ready just in case. have everything nice and ready, be nice and relaxed. Just go through it. Do your best on it, of course. If you miss a question, it probably won't kill you because there'll be quite a few questions, so don't worry too much about that. I'll probably do a curve on it as well. I'm not gonna commit to anything before I do before I see the grades, because if everyone gets 100, I'm not gonna curve that. That'd be kind of silly. I'll probably do about a 10-point curve or something, somewhere around there. I'm gonna say probably 6 points to 12 points will probably be what I end up doing, but I'm gonna wait to commit to that before I see the exam scores. But I have in mind where I think the average should be, and like I said, I'll adjust it up to that point if I need to, and I probably will. So don't worry about the grades or anything like that. Just do your best, have a good time. Yeah, so unfortunately it will be quite a long exam. Again, you'll have 1:20 per question. It's just not a whole lot of control I have over that. I would much rather give you 100 questions and give you 2 hours, but I'm not able to do that. So I'm going to have to stick with what my department and what my university says for that. So regarding additional resources, what exactly do you have in mind? I mean, I've given you every single topic, or at least the vast majority of topics that you'll see on the exam. I mean, if you have any questions about those topics, I'm happy to address any of them. If you give me 20 topics right now, and I'm happy to go through 20 topics, that's not a big problem. Regarding additional information, the textbook is certainly out there. Like I say, the textbook, I'm pretty sure the bookstore made them available for free. I can't make any promises to that. I'm not the bookstore, but I think that that is something they did. You can also probably find a lot of information by looking online for the terms if you need to. And if you absolutely can't find anything, feel free to reach out to me and ask me, hey, I'm having trouble finding information about this term. Can you give me more information about it? I'm happy to do that. I'd rather not be the first resource, but certainly I'm happy to if you're having issues finding it. And I think that's pretty fair. No, this is a comprehensive final. It's going to cover everything. So, Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. The good news is that this can certainly replace, if you did, if maybe you could improve on Exam 1 or Exam 2, that could certainly replace this test grade. Or no, I just said that backwards. The final can replace either Exam 1 or Exam 2 if it benefits you. I should be very careful with how I say that. I don't want to have any confusion regarding that. Okay, so feel free to drop me any questions about the content. I'm happy to go over anything on the class or anything in general. And while I'm waiting on some additional comments, I do want to remind everyone that the course evaluations are going to be due tomorrow. That's for all your classes. I know I certainly appreciate it when people fill them out and give me feedback. I'm sure your other instructors would also be grateful. It just really helps us out quite a bit. I guess as a YouTuber I have to ask you to do something, so that's what I'm going to do. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want, but certainly the course evaluations are how I kind of do my thing. So yeah, the whole exam will be multiple choice. It'll be very similar format to what you've seen before. Like I say, it's pretty much going to be very similar to the last exam, only unfortunately quite a bit longer, but you'll have more time per question. So I do want to make sure that that addresses any major concerns with the. I think a lot of people felt really rushed. That was certainly the biggest. The biggest things were people either didn't have enough time or they felt rushed but did have enough time. I don't want you to feel rushed. So I added 20 seconds additional per question, which is 33%, which is pretty large. And I think that that should be enough time to answer any of the questions. But certainly make sure that you've looked over each of these terms, you're familiar with what they are going into the exam. maybe you want to go through and just jot down a quick note about it. Do whatever you want to. It's certainly up to you. But, yeah. So, yes, the final is not an optional final. So, if you are happy with your grade, it will be affected by this. So, basically, each exam is 25% of your grade. That hasn't changed from the original course policies. I'll still also replace your exam 1 or exam 2 grade if it benefits you with the final. But each exam will count for 25% of your grade. And again, I want to emphasize that hasn't changed. The one thing that has changed, I did put a clarification inside this new syllabus I'll send out to where it's saying that it's not optional. But if you look at the original language, that hasn't changed. So down here, I think. Yeah, so it always talked about them being, that way. Yeah, so they're not optional, but, I think that, with the bonus points, it shouldn't be a huge concern for anyone. Again, let me know what other topics to cover. I'm certainly happy to go through and answer questions about anything. So, there may be some topics on Unit 1, for example, that you don't remember. I could certainly address any of these. I could talk your ear off. I'll try not to, of course, but I could. Yeah, I could talk about these things all day. Just let me know which ones you guys want me to cover. I think it's very possible you'll find that some of the topics are not mentioned in the book. That's a very real possibility. Specifically, when we're talking about some of the Excel concepts we covered, I think that it's quite possible those will not be covered in the textbook. The good news with Excel is that I think the lectures should be available on my YouTube channel, so you can check them out. And beyond that, I could have certainly added some topics. I don't know off the top of my head which ones that I would have added and which ones that would have been covered in the textbook pretty well. Certainly I can look at this and tell that analytical aspirations, analytical companies, analytical competitors, analytically impaired, none of those are covered inside of the textbook. Those are going to be from external resources, specifically from Davenport 2010. That's where I kind of talked about those. So I'll just kind of run through these just because you ask kind of about them. Analytical aspirations would be a company who realizes that they want to use analytics to improve their firm, but they don't yet. Analytically impaired means they don't use any analytics, nor do they see the value inside of it. An analytical company uses it for across the firm, and it has upper management support. And analytical competitors, they use it to make strategic decisions, and they basically use it for improving their competitiveness. So those are some examples of things you might not. Forecasting, I'm pretty sure forecasting's covered in here. Customer facing, that's all covered. I'm not sure whether thin client, zero client, and fat client are covered inside of here. And again, those are technical terms. Those are not meant to be derogatory terms or anything. It has to do with the amount of processing that's done on a local machine versus that's going to be done on a central server and a client-server infrastructure. So with a zero client, of course, you would have no local processing or minimal local processing done on the end machine, whereas most of it would be done on the side of the server. And in a fat client, you have minimal processing done on the server, and most of the processing, if not all, would be done on the client device. I shouldn't say client computer, won't always be a computer. And of course, a thin client is somewhere between that. Some of the processing will be done locally, some of it will be done on the server. Okay, I just covered fat and thin client, so I didn't even see that. But yeah, basically it's just the amount of processing that's done locally. Again, fat client is not a derogatory term. I want to emphasize that. It is a technological term. If you Google fat client, you'll probably find some interesting things, I'd imagine. But again, it is a technical term. You can also find information. It's just like a standard desktop PC is going to be a fat client. A laptop device is going to be a fat client because most of the processing is going to be done on the device itself. You know, the operating system, running applications. It's not going to be run over the network. It's going to be run locally. And you may reference a data, you know, some sort of file storage or something on a server. That's possible. But by and large, that's what the difference is. Great question about Excel. So, I'm going to handle these in a couple different ways. So, I'll go ahead and show this to you all, because it's already in Canvas anyway. Canvas is pretty goofy with how it handles quizzes. So, and I would certainly take advantage of this as well. Let me find it. Okay. So I'll send this out probably tomorrow late at night, but here for the exam. So you'll have this, and you can use this however you want to. If you want to print it off, that's fine. If you have multiple monitors, you can certainly use multiple monitors to have this up on one monitor and your thing up on another. Again, I'm not making you use a lockdown browser or anything like that. It's an open book, open note test. So you'll have access to this. Of course, if you also wanted to, you could also type this out into Excel. That's certainly also a possibility for you, and you could play with it like that. But basically what you'll do is you'll answer questions. Sometimes you'll be given an Excel formula, and you'll have a list of maybe 4 or 5 different Excel formulas, and you'll answer which one will do this thing. So I think it's fair that I pull up at least one sample question for you to actually show you what I'm talking about. And by the way, these are tricky. Certainly do be very careful when you go through them. Okay, I'm not going to show you the entire exam though. Let me just show you one. And this is going to be an actual question you'll see. So, okay. So here's a question right here that you may see. So what you're going to have is you're going to have using the bottleneck data. That's going to tell you to go to the data right here, the bottleneck data. So they are labeled. Again, this is not the best way. Normally you'd have 2 printouts and it'd be a little bit easier to work with, and I could have the graphics, in line with the questions if I needed to. But basically, this is what you'll have. Okay, so it looks like I got this a little bit too large. Make that a little smaller there. So using the bottleneck data, tell which task is furthest from being the bottleneck. So, and I do clarify what the bottleneck is. It's going to be the lowest weighted time for row 2. So the reason I put row 2 is because you're going to go to row 2 and you're going to tell if this task is furthest from being the bottleneck. So I pretty much just gave you the answer. You're going to do if D2, and again, you use D2 because it said in row 2, and of course the bottleneck is derived from the weighted time. You're going to tell if it is the minimum of the D column, because this is all going to have the weighted times within it. Then you're going to say it is furthest from being the bottleneck. So you'd go through here and you'd go through each of these options. You'd say, if D2 is the max, no, we want to know if it's the lowest, not the maximum. So if it's the highest waited time, we want to say which task was the bottleneck. This would be the correct answer, but that's not what the question's asking. So then we go to this next thing down here. Well, it does have D2 is the minimum of this row. That part is correct. However, we don't want to know which the bottleneck. We want to know which is furthest from being the bottleneck. So that doesn't pass that part of it. Then you'd come down here and you would say if D2 is the max, we can go ahead and eliminate that answer choice because we're not looking for the max, we're looking for the one that's furthest from being the max. So then we say if D2 is the minimum of that row, then we're going to output furthest from being the bottleneck. Otherwise, we're going to output null. So, and of course, if requires the condition, then it requires condition if true, then it requires condition if false. So for the false, we're not going to output anything, we're just going to leave it null, which is just open and closed quote there. So that's what you're going to have to do for some of the questions. For other of the questions, I may have you calculate some of the forecasting types that we had in class. So certainly, if you wanted to review over that video, I go pretty far in depth into them, to the point that I think it may even be a little bit, well, it may not be the most exciting video you've ever seen, let's just say that. But, it certainly does cover each of these in a tremendous amount of detail. So I could ask you about the naive forecast, I could ask you to calculate the seasonal naive forecast, I could ask you to calculate weighted moving average, stuff like that. So, that's, you may actually be calculating them, or you may be giving me the Excel formulas to calculate them. Either way, certainly it'd be a great idea to check out the different, the 2 videos that are out there regarding the Excel tutorials online. Great question, by the way. That's certainly a good thing to ask. So if you want to review exam 2, send me an email. I'm happy to set up a Skype and do that remotely. Unfortunately, if I put the questions out there, then the questions would be out there. But I am happy to address any questions that you missed and set up a Skype. Happy to do that with anyone who asks. So, can I go over organizational levels? Certainly. So you of course have the strategic level, which is going to be comprised primarily of, actually entirely of upper level management, which we often think of as being quote C-level, CEO, CIO, CFO, maybe COO. A lot of those types of very important positions, they're going to be the ones that set the strategy, they set a lot of the mission statements, all that sort of thing are going to be comprised of by the top level of the organization. They're going to also set a lot of long-term decisions. And then of course we have operational, which is the lowest level of the organization. It's where a lot of the stuff kind of happens. You have, the laborers, you have the line workers, that sort of thing. And, in between those two, you have the tactical level. That's going to be middle management. Things like, depending on how the organization is structured, managers and directors would go there, to where they control maybe some department, but they don't control, the entire organization. So that's pretty much what you'd have there. And, the different decisions they would make, again, they'd make a lot of different types of decisions. Organizationally speaking, I think that the operational division will make the decisions with the least amount of consequences. Typically it's going to be the lowest amount at stake, whereas of course the strategic decisions would be the ones with the most amount at stake. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers. Let me know if it doesn't. I'm certainly happy to. Infrastructure as a service and software as a service. Let me just pull this cloud computing guide right back up. So what you would have is, with infrastructure as a service, you're going to be basically purchasing, it's almost like if you had a server and you could just install whatever you wanted to on there. That's basically what you're getting with infrastructure as a service. You having a space dedicated to you can install whatever operating system, you can install whatever software you want on there, as well as things in between. With platform as a service, you already have the operating system given to you, but you can install any applications that you want to on it. And then lastly, with software as a service, you have an application that's going to be serviced up to you, typically via a web browser, but it doesn't have to be via a web browser. There are many ways to do software as a service that do not involve a web browser. Could involve things like a Citrix client, but you don't have to know that for the exam or anything. That's just kind of supplemental information. When you use your webmail, that's using software as a service. You don't have to install anything to use it. You just navigate to the web page. It goes ahead and serves you up the application. It handles, the operating system and all that other stuff. So that's pretty much a good little rundown. This graphic right here is going to be pretty important to kind of understand, where the control lies from the organization itself. So of course, all this stuff in this yellowish color or golden color is going to be managed by the customer. That is to say, the firm. And then the stuff in orange down here, whatever color that is, it's going to be managed by the external vendor. So the vendor is going to basically sell you a product or service kind of relating to that. Okay, what other questions do we have? And again, I'm happy to take any questions regarding anything from the study guide, anything from the course, questions about policies, questions about anything. Yeah, I've enjoyed it. It's been a good semester. I like this class material a lot. It's covers a lot of different topics. Get to cover it from a managerial standpoint. Don't have to get bogged down too much with technological concepts. It's certainly one that I like teaching. I hope that you all liked it as well. Certainly, I guess I'll know after the evaluations come back. But I certainly hope that all of you learned at least a few things, hopefully a lot of things, but if you came in a genius, I hope you still left a genius. It all depends upon that. What do you mean by will the exam be random? Help me understand what you're meaning by that. So are you asking, are the questions going to be like Unit 1 questions, then Unit 2 questions, then Unit 3 questions? Is that what you're asking about? Okay, that's a good question. I believe the questions will be in random order, so I can't make any promises that it'll stick from Unit 1 to Unit 2 to Unit 3. That's something that Canvas does, where it puts the questions in a randomized order, I believe. But certainly, like I say, feel free to use any resources you want to. You do have a minute 20 per question. I would anticipate that means that you'll have time to look up about 10 to 20% of the questions. If you're quicker at looking things up, maybe you'll have time to look up, 30% or so. But certainly, like I say, the best thing you can do to study for this test is to go through each of these terms and make sure that you know what it is, how a business may use it, and, things like that. Like, for example, we talked about cables, coaxial cable. We talked about some advantages and disadvantages of coaxial. We talked about advantages and disadvantages of twisted pair. Talked about advantages and disadvantages of fiber optic. And I said I said in the class, I disagree with the book's definition and the book saying that twisted pair is going to be inherently slower than fiber optic. I talked about the different specifications of fiber. I talked about some of the different specifications of twisted pair, and how it's not really that cut and dry to where you're talking about, the speed that a cable can transmit things. Latency, maybe it is, because you're talking about using a light signal versus an electrical signal. Obviously, the light signal is going to be able to transfer at pretty close to, if not the speed of light, versus, you're talking about transmitting over electrical signal, which is going to be a little slower than that. And I want to be clarified. When I talk about speed, I'm talking about latency. I'm not talking about capacity. It's certainly possible to have a cable that transmits less information. We're talking about bandwidth. We talk about bits per second. So I could have a fiber optic cable with a very low latency, but that's only capable of doing 100 megabits per second. Whereas I could have a twisted pair cable that's capable of transmitting signal, much faster in terms of the speed. When we're talking about bits per second, maybe it can do 1 gigabit per second, or maybe it can do 10 gigabits per second. But it may still have slightly higher latency. Will it be noticeable? I don't know. It will probably be less than 1 millisecond of latency. So would that be measurable? With specialized equipment, yeah, I'll say that. In practice, probably not. Good question, though. Okay. So, will the final cover Unit 3? I don't think it covers it that much more heavily. I think that it breaks down to where you'll have about 60 questions from Unit 3, and the other questions will come from Unit 1 and 2. You'll probably have more questions over Unit 2 just because there are more chapters associated with it, and also because it's more recent. I don't really like the concept of giving you a whole bunch of stuff you had, what would that be, like almost 12 weeks ago? You may have some questions relating to that. Again, the best thing you can do is to go through each of these and make sure that you can tell what they are. At minimum, just make sure okay, like you have email closing. You should know what an email closing is, about how long it should be, and, the general format of it, things like that. Know what email etiquette is, know some of the basic rules associated with it, email length, things like that. If you know what these are, then you shouldn't have any problem associated with it. And I'm certain, again, I want to emphasize, I'm very happy right now is a perfect time. Ask any of these questions. Ask about any of these different terms on here. There's a lot of terms on here. So we've got about 70 terms from Unit 1, about 139 terms from Unit 2, and I would say probably about 96 terms from Unit 3. That's a lot of terms. So certainly if you have any questions about any of them, I'm happy to take them. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of people say yes. What exactly are you saying yes to? I'm not... So I want a little bit of clarification about that. Will there be an identifiable order based on unit? Again, just to my knowledge, I'm pretty sure that Canvas randomizes the order of questions. That's what I've been told. So, again, if you wanted to know what where something was, you could probably have this exact spreadsheet up, and you could do a Control F throughout it, and you could also do things like make it all units if you want, and these are things you could do. And you could of course come through here, just kind of grab all these terms, and you could do things like Unit 1. And you could of course copy this down to all the Unit 1 terms. Whoops. So now you know which terms are from Unit 1. And you could do the same thing for Unit 2, for example. And you just copy this down to all the Unit 2 terms. I mean, there's really no limitation. This is open book, open note, kind of regarding that. You can do whatever you want. And I'd certainly recommend taking advantage of that. I think that, that's a very brilliant thing to do. It's not the only thing to do, but it's certainly a brilliant thing to do. Then you could have, Unit 3, if you wanted to. Again, it's really up to you, however you want to do this. So, then you could simply, let's say you get a test question like this question I gave you. So you'd say, I don't remember what bottleneck is. Where was that at? So you could come through here and you could say bottleneck. Well, if I spelled bottleneck correctly, you could have done that. Yeah, so you need to say, okay, bottleneck is in Unit 3. That's something you could do. But I'm pretty sure that Canvas randomizes the order of questions. I could be wrong about that. Yeah, there is quite a big delay, unfortunately, in the stream. That's a limitation with either Open Broadcast or YouTube. I'm not sure which. I don't know how to address that. I do apologize for that. Again, it's at least like a 10-second delay, maybe 15 seconds. And, there's not a lot I can do about it. Imagine being in a classroom and it took me 15 seconds to understand what you guys were saying. Okay, I shouldn't crack myself up. Okay, so Geo, Leo, Hio, and all those. Let me just show you a graphic. So basically what you have is you have these different types of orbits for satellites. And, as you get closer and closer to the Earth, you have this idea that there's going to be a lesser amount of latency. There's going to be less latency, I should say. Because to go from, let's say, 100 miles and back, it's going to take less time than going from, say, 30,000 miles and back. So basically what we have is we have things like low Earth orbit. That's this orbit that's very close to the Earth. It has a very low, or relatively low amount of latency, in the milliseconds for a signal to reach a satellite and back. And that's going to provide us with a lot of advantages for things like synchronous communication. As we're seeing right now, this is somewhat synchronous, but not entirely. There's quite a bit of a latency, if you will. The time from whenever you say a comment to whenever I see it, it's going to be pretty high. That's going to contrast with mid-Earth orbit. Mid-Earth orbit is going to be in between low Earth orbit and geostationary orbit, such that, in geostationary orbit, it's going to be a very large distance away. Now, that's both good and bad. It's good in that you can have a lot fewer satellites, somewhere in the ballpark of like 6 to 8 satellites, not 68, 6 to 8 satellites. That's a tiny amount of satellites. Could provide coverage to the entire world of your signal. Whereas if you have low Earth orbit, it's going to take probably in the ballpark of hundreds, maybe thousands. I'm not a physicist. I'm not going to pretend like I would be able to solve that. But basically what you have is, it's like if you had a flashlight and you had let's say it's dark, you had a flashlight and a ball. As you put the flashlight closer to the ball, you're going to see that it's going to cover less of the ball. Think of the ball as Earth, okay? So as you get the signal closer to Earth, it's going to take you a larger amount of flashlights or satellites to provide coverage to the entire situation there. So it also, of course, costs more to launch something into geostationary orbit than it does to launch something into low Earth orbit. A lot of physics reasons for that, of course. You're going less distant. You're going more distance in geostationary. You're going less distance in low Earth orbit. Again, that's pretty much what you need to know. Just know that as you get further away from the Earth, you're going to have more latency. Speed won't be affected. At least, let me rephrase that. Speed won't be directly affected by that, because speed is bits per second. You could have bits per second, but you could get them a second later. Now, of course, with geostationary, you would probably see that. That's common for things like satellite TV, because if your TV signal's delayed, a second or two, it's not gonna, have a huge impact. But for things like web browsing, especially things like watching video, that could cause some issues. Things like gaming. If you're gaming and you have a second worth of lag, you're not going to be able to play that. So for things like that, it's pretty important, but for other things, it's not. So we can certainly use geostationary orbits for a lot of things, but not everything. Oh, and then highly elliptical orbit would be one we don't really cover it in this class, but basically a highly elliptical orbit is that, as the name implies, it's going to have an orbit that's going to be highly elliptical. Sometimes it'll be very close to the Earth, sometimes it'll be very far from the Earth, and it's going to be inside an ellipse. So let me get out my good friend Microsoft Paint to kind of show you all what I'm talking about here. So if this right here were the Earth, then we would have the highly elliptical orbit look something like this. Well, something like that. Where sometimes it's going to be very close to the Earth and other times it will be very far from the Earth. So it's difficult to kind of gauge how that would play out. The others more or less don't have that problem. So if we did like low Earth orbit, that may be something like what low Earth orbit would look like. Again, this is not the scale. That would be quite a bit larger than low Earth orbit would actually be. Then you'd have something like maybe mid-Earth orbit would look something like this. And let's say geostationary Earth orbit would look something like this. This is a rough approximation, but you could see that, if we get a little triangle tool here, when we go, well, this is not a perfect triangle, but you get the idea. So let's say a satellite could cover this amount in a low Earth orbit. Let's say that a satellite in a mid-Earth orbit could cover, say, an amount kind of like that. And inside of a high Earth orbit, let's say that a satellite could cover an amount like that. You kind of get what this is kind of showing, is that as you move further and further out, the amount of satellites is going to be lower and lower. I know it's not the prettiest looking drawing you've ever seen, but that's just kind of some quick little math there. Okay, any other questions to topics, anything like that you want me to cover? Okay, again, I do want to remind everyone the quizzes are due today. Just to kind of go over this again, I will be sending out an updated syllabus. Unfortunately, I did have to make some minor modifications to the exam policies. Some of them are beneficial to you, some of them, well, they're changes that the university requires, so I do apologize for that. But, like I say, you will have more time per question. You'll just have a lot of questions, unfortunately. Again, if it were up to me, I'd give you 100 questions in 120 minutes, but it's not up to me, so. But that said, it's not the end of the world. These are changes that are going to be made. Just wanted to discuss them. As the syllabus says, I think somewhere in here, I'll discuss them in class and via email. So I'll send out an email about this as well. Again, these are not major changes, though. Yeah. Any other questions, though? And by the way, tomorrow rather, is the last day to submit teaching evaluations. I'd certainly encourage you to submit them for my class as well as any other classes you're taking. It's a way to have your voice heard, I guess. any other questions about any of these terms or anything we've covered in class. And again, this is just one suggestion for how to figure out which unit comes from which term, but you could do it a lot of different ways. So it looks like there's about 300 terms to know, roughly. That is a lot of terms, but a lot of the terms are stuff that's pretty self-explanatory, and there may even be some things that are somewhat repeated, like a cycle and cyclicity. Well, if you know what a cyclicity is, you know what a cycle is as well. Yeah, so there are a lot of terms, but like I say, next couple minutes, feel free to ask me what any of them mean, and I will do my best to explain them. And also, if you ask an earlier question and you're still a little bit foggy on it, and I didn't fully explain something, or feel free to let me know. I don't mind at all going back over something. I'm certainly happy to do that. And then while everyone's doing that, I will also, I guess, kind of plug my own YouTube channel here. If you're caught up on some of these different things that you're doing, in the class, I do have the past lectures posted. I don't know if you've seen them or not, but we have, for example, the supply chain management tutorial inside of Excel. That's only about 37 minutes. You could watch it on maybe, 1.25 times speed. You could watch it on 1.15 speed. However you want to watch it, it's fine. Pause it, rewind it. You've got all those opportunities. Also got the business analytics where I go through that. So, the tutorials are all there, as well as the lectures, at least up until exam 2, I guess is going to be there. So from exam 3, all the lectures are online. Certainly go through them if you would like to. You don't have to, of course, but apart from that, I think that pretty much about covers it. I'll hop over to the Microsoft Teams page if anyone wants to join me there, and you can ask any questions. But apart from that, I'll give everyone about 30 seconds more if they want to ask any questions. I'm happy to address them, but I don't see anyone doing that anymore. So, and that's not a problem either way. Like I said, I'm happy to continue to answer any questions, but I'm just, if there's no one asking questions, then it's kind of, I think the people understand what I'm saying there. So I'll give you all a couple more seconds here if you have any last minute questions. Thanks for coming, by the way. It's been a great semester. Hope you all enjoyed it. I certainly did. So, any last minute questions? Alright, so I don't see any last minute questions. I'm going to go ahead and hop over to Teams. If anyone wants to hop on there, I'll probably be there for a bit, and you can ask any questions. You could talk if you wanted to inside of Teams, of course. I hope you all have a great semester. Good luck on your finals, and have a great day.